In 1928, a single flash of light froze America's darkest secret. That image, a woman's body jerking inside an electric chair, would haunt the nation for decades. Her name was Ruth Snyder, and she became the first person in U.S. history ever photographed in the exact moment of her execution. But that photograph wasn't supposed to exist. It was captured illegally by a journalist who risked his job, his freedom, and his life to expose something the government desperately wanted to hide. What you're about to hear isn't just the story of a murder. It's the story of how one forbidden photograph forced America to confront its addiction to death. By the end of this film, you'll understand how a single click of a hidden camera terrified the justice system, sparked nationwide outrage, and permanently changed how executions are carried out in the United States. So, before we peel back the curtain on one of history's most shocking media stunts, hit subscribe, because the truth you're about to see was buried for almost a century. It's 1927, the jazz age is roaring. Prohibition is law, speakeasies are packed, and Wall Street is printing millionaires by the hour. On the surface, America glitters, but behind the parties and champagne, there's something rotten. Public executions are still entertainment. Newspapers compete to print the most graphic details of a criminal's last breath. America is drunk on spectacle, and it's about to meet its next obsession, her name. Ruth Snyder. At first glance, Ruth could have been anyone's neighbor. A pretty woman in her 30s, blonde hair curled to perfection, always wearing pearls. A perfect housewife, or so it seemed. She lived in Queens, New York, with her husband, Albert Snyder, a stern, old-fashioned man, and their young daughter. But behind that neat suburban home, Ruth was living a double life, one built on resentment, greed, and an affair that would spiral into one of the most notorious murders of the century. Ruth had a problem. Her husband was worth more dead than alive. Exactly $96,000 more, the equivalent of $15 million today. And that was no accident. For months, Ruth had been forging Albert's signature, secretly adding new life insurance policies, layer upon layer. Until her payday was set, she'd even roped in her lover, Judd Gray, a corset salesman with a timid face and a weak will, to help her carry out the perfect murder. But perfect murders don't exist. On the night of March 20th, 1927, the house on 222nd Street was silent. Albert was asleep in bed, snoring softly. Ruth stood over him in the dark, clutching a sash weight, a heavy metal counterweight from a window pulley system. She took a deep breath and brought it down. Once, twice, 7 brutal strikes. The man who had once called her darling was gone. But the murder was only half her plan. What came next was performance. She tied herself up with rope, deliberately leaving the knots loose enough to escape. She tossed furniture, broke a few dishes, and made the house look like a crime scene. Then she waited. At dawn, she discovered the body and screamed for help. When police arrived, Ruth played the part of the hysterical widow. She told detectives that a pair of Italian burglars had broken in, attacked her, and murdered her husband. But there was just one problem. Nothing about her story made sense. Detective Arthur Carey, one of New York's most experienced investigators, later wrote, "Something about her story stank from the minute she opened her mouth. The supposed burglars had ransacked the house, but ignored the expensive jewelry sitting in plain sight. The ropes around Ruth's wrists were tied in sloppy single loops, easy to slip off. Her husband had been beaten to death, but Ruth didn't have so much as a bruise. And then came her biggest mistake. Tucked under a pillow in the living room, police found a motive in handwriting, an insurance application filled out and signed, not by Albert, but by Ruth herself. Within hours, detectives uncovered her secret affair with Judd Gray, and when they confronted him, he folded instantly. He confessed everything. How Ruth had begged him to help kill her husband, how they'd planned the timing, and how she promised they'd start a new life with the insurance money. By sunrise, both lovers were in handcuffs. The perfect murder had unraveled in less than 12 hours, but this story doesn't And with their arrest, it's only beginning, because what came next would transform a murder case into a national obsession. The newspapers couldn't get enough. Front pages screamed, "Ice blonde murderess!" Reporters followed every step of Ruth's trial, describing her clothes, her hair, even the way she looked at the jury. America wasn't just watching her. They were entertained by her, and when the jury finally declared Ruth Snyder guilty and sentenced her to death by electric chair, the country didn't flinch. They wanted to see it. They wanted to witness justice served, live, if possible. What no one knew was that a man named Tom Howard, a reporter for the New York Daily News, was about to make that wish come true. He would sneak into the death chamber with a hidden camera strapped to his ankle, risking arrest, disgrace, and his life, to capture the moment the switch was thrown. And when that shutter clicked, it would freeze more than an image. It would expose the American soul itself. Within hours, Ruth Snyder's perfect crime began to crumble, not because of police brilliance, but because of her own arrogance. The detectives who walked into her Queens home could smell the lie before she even finished telling it. And when they searched her bedroom, what they found changed everything. Hidden beneath her neatly folded clothes were letters, pages soaked in perfume and desperation. They weren't just love notes. They were blueprints for murder. The words revealed an affair so scandalous it would make front-page headlines across the nation. The man behind those letters, Henry Judd Gray, a timid corset salesman from Syracuse. To the world, he was mild, soft-spoken, the kind of man who sold lace and stayed invisible. But to Ruth, he was something else entirely, her weapon. She had spun a web of manipulation so tight that Gray could no longer tell right from wrong. She convinced him that her husband, Albert, was a monster, abusive, violent, and plotting to kill her. Ruth whispered that their only escape was murder. And so when detectives finally cornered Henry in his hotel room, he broke like glass. In a trembling voice, he confessed everything, every lie, every letter, every brutal detail. But America didn't see two killers. They saw a seductress and her puppet. The newspapers pounced like vultures. "Ruthless Ruth," screamed one headline. "The blonde Borgia of Queens," shouted another. The New York Daily News crowned her the coldest woman who ever lived. And what about Henry Judd Gray, the man who actually swung the sash weight and crushed Albert's skull? Reporters painted him as a helpless victim, a good man lured to sin by the devil in a dress. Because in 1920s America, women weren't supposed to be masterminds. They were supposed to be temptresses or victims, never strategists. That's how Ruth became public enemy number one. And Henry, the weak-willed lover. When the trial began on April 18, 1927, it was less a courtroom and more a theater stage. Over 1,500 reporters fought for seats. Western Union installed new telegraph lines to handle the tidal wave of news. Radio stations broadcast live updates as America listened transfixed. This was decades before O.J. Simpson, but make no mistake, it was the original trial of the century. Imagine the scene. Ruth sits at the defendant's table, calm, composed, dressed in black with a single strand of pearls. Her face gives nothing away. Every flash of a camera, every whisper from the jury bounces off her like stone. Across from her, Henry sobs uncontrollably. His voice cracks as he insists Ruth forced him into the crime. His tears make him sympathetic. Her silence makes her dangerous. The prosecution tears Ruth apart piece by piece. They hold up her love letters. They display the forged insurance documents. And then they read her own contradictory statements aloud, the ones that expose her entire story as a fabrication. District Attorney Richard Nuakomi looks the jury dead in the eyes and says, "This woman is not a victim. She is a predator. She used sex and lies to turn a weak man into her weapon." The jury doesn't hesitate. After just 2 hours, they deliver their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, both Ruth and Henry are sentenced to death by electric chair. But while the world should have moved on, the story was far from over, because what came next would immortalize Ruth Snyder forever in one single, horrifying photograph. January 12th, 1928. Sing Sing Prison. Ruth Snyder is led down the narrow concrete hallway toward the death chamber. 24 witnesses sit in silence as the guards strap her into the chair. What no one knows is that among them sits a man with a secret and a camera hidden under his pant leg. His name was Tom Howard, a photographer for the Chicago Tribune. For weeks he'd been planning what seemed impossible, capturing the first ever photograph of an American execution. Cameras were forbidden. Witnesses were searched. Any attempt to photograph the death penalty could lead to years in prison. But Howard wasn't just chasing a scoop, he was chasing history. He built a tiny custom camera, strapped it to his ankle, ran a hidden wire up through his pant leg into his coat pocket. One squeeze of that cable and he'd take the most dangerous picture ever made. Now as Ruth sits in the chair, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, the warden gives the signal. The switch is thrown. The current surges, and in that split-second click, Howard presses the trigger. The camera hidden beneath his cuff captures the exact moment electricity floods Ruth Snyder's body. No flash, no sound, no one notices. Within 24 hours, the image explodes across America. The next morning's front page of the New York Daily News bears the now iconic headline, "Dead." Beneath it, Ruth's lifeless body, mid-execution, stares back at the nation. For the first time, Americans are forced to confront what execution really looks like. The glamour of justice vanishes. All that remains is horror. The photograph becomes a national scandal. Lawmakers call it indecent. The church calls it sinful. The government moves quickly, banning execution photography nationwide. But it's too late. The image had already burned itself into history. Ruth Snyder's death, meant to erase her name, instead made her immortal. And Tom Howard's forbidden photograph exposed the truth America never wanted to see, that beneath the polished surface of justice there was blood, electricity, and the thrill of spectacle. The chair stood in the center of the chamber, a grotesque throne of steel and leather, surrounded by thick glass so witnesses could watch a human being die without flinching. The air reeked of disinfectant, sweat, and the metallic tang of voltage waiting to ignite. You could almost taste the fear. At exactly 11:01 p.m., the heavy doors opened. Ruth Snyder, pale, restrained, and trembling, was led into the room. Moments earlier, she had written a final letter to her daughter, still swearing she was innocent. Now she was about to become part of history, for all the wrong reasons. Guards tightened the straps around her arms and legs. The thick leather pressed against her skin. The metal cap lowered onto her head. The room fell silent, except for the hum of generators and the faint clicking of reporters' pens on paper. Among the 24 witnesses was one man who didn't belong there, a journalist named Tom Howard, the man who would risk his freedom to expose America's darkest secret. Howard's heart pounded so loudly he swore everyone could hear it. Hidden beneath his pant leg, strapped just above his ankle, was a miniature camera. A cable ran up through his clothing, ending in a small switch concealed in his jacket pocket. One click, one breathless moment, and he would capture what no one was ever meant to see. 6 p.m. The executioner pulled the lever. A violent surge of 2,000 volts tore through Ruth's body. Her hands clenched, her back arched, and in that split second Tom Howard pressed the trigger, a blinding hiss, the sound of electricity crackling through flesh. And then silence. The photograph was taken. The forbidden image now existed, hidden in the camera on Howard's leg. But the danger was far from over. Getting that photo out of Sing Sing prison would take every ounce of courage he had. Howard limped out of the chamber, pretending to adjust his socks. Outside, a contact from the New York Daily News waited to retrieve the camera and rush the film to the darkroom. Hours later, in a cloud of chemical fumes and fear, the image developed, ghostly, horrifying, unforgettable. The next morning, America would wake up to a nightmare. January 13th, 1928. The front page of the New York Daily News hit the streets with a single word across it in bold, black letters: "Dead." Beneath it, Tom Howard's photograph. Ruth Snyder caught in the instant of death, her body twisted, her face frozen in agony, the leather straps cutting deep into her skin. For the first time in American history, the public saw what an execution actually looked like. The reaction was nuclear. Churches condemned the paper for blasphemy. Politicians called it indecent. Prison officials launched a furious investigation, desperate to know how a camera had made it inside a death chamber under maximum security. But none of that mattered, because the American people couldn't stop looking. 15 million copies of that newspaper sold in a single day, the highest circulation in U.S. history. Crowds gathered at newsstands. Lines wrapped around the block. Some stared in shock, others in fascination. For the first time, Americans saw their justice system not as moral or righteous, but as barbaric. You could see the leather straps biting into her wrists, the metal skull cap pressing into her scalp, the curve of her neck twisted by invisible hands of electricity. It wasn't justice, it was theater. And that single image shattered the illusion of humane execution forever. Letters flooded newspaper offices by the thousands. "How dare you show us this horror," one reader wrote. But another said, "Thank you. Now I understand what we do in our name. I will never support the death penalty again." That photograph did something no law, no sermon, no protest ever could. It forced America to face the brutality it had hidden behind curtains and official statements. Within months, execution rules changed nationwide. Cameras were permanently banned. Witness lists shrank. Security doubled, and the age of execution secrecy began, but the impact reached far beyond prison walls. The photo ignited a national conversation about morality, gender, and justice itself. Should women be executed the same way as men? Could any execution, electric, hanging, or otherwise, ever be considered humane? If society couldn't bear to see its own justice, was it truly justice at all? Tom Howard never faced trial. By the time officials realized what he had done, he was already back in Chicago, untouchable. When asked why he risked everything, his answer was chillingly simple. "I showed America what it really looks like when we kill someone." People needed to see that. Ruth Snyder's death marked the end of an era. Never again would executions be treated like public entertainment. Her photograph, that single forbidden moment, accomplished what decades of activism had failed to do. It made people question whether watching someone die was justice or savagery. That single image turned the death penalty from a spectacle into a secret, from a public ritual into a private punishment. And it all happened because one man, with a hidden camera and an unshakable conscience, showed America the truth. But the most haunting part of all, nearly a century later, we still haven't learned. We binge-watch death on streaming platforms. We turn killers into celebrities. We've traded the newspaper photo for true crime documentaries, but the obsession is the same. We still can't look away. The forbidden photograph didn't just capture the death of one woman. It captured the death of innocence. The moment America realized that justice and spectacle had become one and the same. And that maybe, just maybe, we've been watching ever since. Ruth Snyder thought she had orchestrated the perfect crime, a flawless murder that would free her from a loveless marriage and grant her the life she'd always dreamed of. But history had other plans. Her story didn't end with her crime. It ended with a flash of light, one that would expose not only her final moment, but America's darkest reflection. Staring back from the front page, that single photograph didn't just capture Ruth Snyder's death. It captured a nation's conscience. In that haunting image, her body bound to the electric chair, her head snapped forward, electricity coursing through her frame. America saw something it could never unsee. The photograph stripped away every illusion of dignity, every pretense of civility that surrounded the death penalty. For the first time, the public witnessed what it really meant to execute someone. That image turned Ruth Snyder, a murderer, into something far more consequential, a symbol of truth. The woman whose death forced an entire country to confront its appetite for blood and spectacle. Tom Howard's forbidden photograph had done what no politician, no preacher, no protest had ever accomplished. It made the death penalty real, raw, human, ugly. When the image hit newsstands that cold January morning in 1928, it stopped America in its tracks. It wasn't just news, it was revelation. The front page of the New York Daily News screamed a single word in bold black type, "Dead." And beneath it, the photo. No artist could have painted it. No journalist could have described it. It was too immediate, too intimate, too real. Some called it blasphemy. Others called it justice. But no one could look away. In living rooms, barbershops, and street corners, people whispered about what they'd seen. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. Men stared in silence. Preachers condemned it from their pulpits, calling it an assault on human dignity. But in between all that outrage, something else was happening. Something profound. People began to question what it meant to watch someone die and to call it justice. Letters flooded newspaper offices from across the country. "How could you publish this horror?" one reader demanded. But another wrote something different. "Thank you for showing us what we've become. I will never support the death penalty again." Tom Howard had done it. He had forced America to look in the mirror. Within weeks, prisons across the nation banned cameras and tightened security. From that day forward, no journalist would ever get that close again. The era of open, visible executions, the public spectacle, was over. Behind locked doors and heavy curtains, the state's most secret ritual would continue in private. Quiet, sanitized, hidden, all because one man had the courage to show the truth. And one woman's final moment had burned itself into the American soul. But the consequences went deeper than any policy change. The photograph ignited a national conversation about morality, equality, and humanity itself. Should women face the same punishment as men? Was death by electricity humane, or simply another form of torture dressed up as progress? Religious leaders began to question whether any execution could truly be righteous. Legal scholars debated whether the state had crossed a moral line it could never uncross. And beneath it all was that photograph, a frozen instant that refused to fade from memory. Tom Howard never faced arrest. By the time prison officials pieced together what he'd done, how he'd hidden a camera strapped to his ankle and triggered it through a cable in his pocket, he was long gone. Safe in Chicago, free. The statute of limitations expired before they could even summon him for questioning. When asked years later if he regretted it, Howard simply said, "I showed America what it really looks like when we kill someone." People needed to see that. That sentence became his legacy. Ruth Snyder's execution marked more than the end of a sensational murder trial. It marked the end of an era, when executions were public entertainment, when death was a spectacle sold with headlines and hype. Her death, and the image that immortalized it, transformed how America viewed justice itself, because for the first time, people realized something terrifying. If executions were too horrific to photograph, maybe they were too horrific to perform at all. The photograph that changed everything didn't just expose a crime. It exposed us, and nearly a century later, the questions it raised haven't gone away. Today, our fascination with death has simply evolved. We no longer crowd around newsstands, we stream it. We no longer whisper about real murders, we binge-watch them. From podcasts to documentaries, from Netflix specials to viral TikToks, we still consume death as entertainment. Only now it's cleaner, faster, wrapped in storytelling and soundtracks. But the impulse hasn't changed. We still can't look away. Ruth Snyder believed she'd written the perfect ending to her own story. But instead, she became the beginning of something far greater, a moment of national reckoning. Because sometimes one photograph can reveal more truth than 1,000 trials. Sometimes one forbidden image can change a nation forever. Now, I want to hear from you. Was Tom Howard's photograph groundbreaking journalism, a courageous act that exposed the brutal truth America needed to see? Or was it exploitation, a violation of a human being's final moment, no matter her crimes? Tell me in the comments below. And if you found this story as haunting and fascinating as I did, you won't want to miss what's next. Because in the next episode, we're uncovering the true story that inspired Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a real-life killer whose crimes were far darker than any film ever dared to show. Subscribe and keep watching, because sometimes the most shocking stories are the ones that really happened.